Bonjour à tous.
Hello everyone, my name is Gaëlle. I'm delighted to welcome you for this roundtable dedicated to rebuilding the food system. There's many of you here in this room, but also online, and we thank you for this. You'll have the opportunity at the end of this discussion to have a Q&A, so please don't hesitate. And I will now welcome all the speakers. We have Jennifer BAARN, you're the Director of Partnerships of the Alliance for the Green Coalition in Africa. We also have Carlos Enrique CAVELIER. You are the Coordinator of Rêve, or Dreams, and you're the President of the Colombian company Alqueria. We also have Nathalie BEGHIN. You are an economist. You're the member of the National Council of Food Security in Brazil. You will also have Romain Blanchard, who is the Deputy Secretary General of ANSEMA. And we also have Thierry BLANDINIÈRES. You're the General Director of the In Vivo Agricultural Cooperative Company. And I'll give the floor to my friend Akiko SUWA-EISENMANN, who's economist in the Cercle des Économistes and who's also an expert in the United Nations to introduce this topic. Thank you. Hello, everyone. For 20 years, food safety has been undermined by climate crisis, as Mr. Lucas reminded us this morning during the opening. Financial crisis of 2008, natural disasters, epidemics, and the numerous conflicts in a lot of countries. More than 280 million people in 59 countries are in a state of acute food insecurity, according to the IPC foods classification. More than one household in 5 doesn't manage to eat properly or needs to sell assets to eat, with long-term consequences. These multiple shocks strike the food system at different levels: agriculture, agri-food processing systems. We know that the first victims of COVID in the US were the workers in the slaughterhouses, but also trade. They also strike one country one after the other. Households, governments do not have any budgetary margin to answer to the shocks. Households have exhausted all their remedies. They don't feel supported. They lose trust in the government. To respond to these shocks, we need to reinforce the food system as a whole. The food system is 3 components: the value chain from farm to the fork. We should also include waste collection, all the conditions in which we take our decisions, such as education, nutrition, publicity, and also the consumer's decisions. These 3 components together will determine what we eat and its impact on health, society, and planet. And all this is taking place in a background of exhaustion of resources, water, pollution, and soil exhaustion. So to go back to the food system, we have to set aside the fake solutions, the false solutions, namely to act only one element on farmers, for instance, or consumers, or ask everything from the consumers. Another wrong solution is to find a scapegoat, to say that, to shame and blame Europe. It's a bad solution because the food trade loss is with the Europeans and not with the rest of the world. We should ban exports. That would actually expose us to problems with our partners. We're a big exporting country. What about shaming and blaming immigration? What about labor? We need external labor for farming, for factories, for trade, for hospitality, and what about naming and shaming the green impact? What about then we wouldn't fight against pollution? The good solution, the right solution, consists in adapting a global approach to reinforce the food system as a whole, to work on all the links, the components of food system. That requires coordination among the different stakeholders, which is quite difficult because they have divergent and dissenting needs and opinions. There's a lot of inequalities. Large distribution is dominated by a very few stakeholders that share a large portion of the market. 1/3 of the salaried employees, and they generate 42% of the turnover. Farms, actually, the farms landscape is where there are most inequalities. We need to rebuild the food system, but for this, we need to take into account all the different sizes, the balance and imbalances of power. We need to make them work together to ensure food security today and tomorrow, and to respond and face and address food security issues and social inequality issues. Thank you. Thank you, Akiko. We see the dilemma of the countries. We need to preserve food safety. We need not to impact on the consumers. We need to make sure that they can feed themselves. But we need to preserve also the income of farmers. Sometimes it's difficult to have both issues tackled at once. So what do you think? Should we ensure first food security or safety or security? What do you think? What an introduction. It's difficult to take over and to take the floor after that because everything has been said and we can see how the world can be complex today. The vision of globalization, how it has evolved. Farming has turned worldwide very easily. We've had the GATT very soon. We talked about vegetable protein, saying that it's in Brazil and the US, and we would have the cereals. We'll still work with this world segmentation nowadays. And we can see the anxiety that it triggers this way of the world. And that refers back to problems of sovereignty. We were talking about happy globalization earlier on, but we're not there yet. Globalization, however, is still in existence. So we can't go back to local markets, to European markets or French market. We need to adjust our globalization policy in such a way where we could have geopolitical dimensions for cereals, for instance. We've seen it with Russia, for instance, in Ukraine. We can see the impact on inflation. Wheat has become a weapon for some countries to generate inflation and destabilize our economies. And facing this, what could we do in France, in Europe? That's a European response that we have to forge, not only French. So quickly, we have to coordinate ourselves with a European policy, public policy, so that it would take into account this new game change. The Green Deal that was done just before this crisis did not integrate this dimension of sovereignty and evolution of world geopolitics on cereals and world food flows. So we are looking at only one angle. How do we find solutions facing these food-related issues and environmental issues in France? And in Europe, we thought, let's decrease our production, but we should have a better quality. And that's behind us now. Our logic is to say, why don't we put sovereignty in the center? How can we produce more with less, better, at a competitive price? Because this is also important for exportation purposes. We can't play on the French market with French consumers. We have to work with the African continent because it's very important with the immigration. So we have a mission. We need to export our cereals to these countries because with climate change, we will never be able to relocate production in these countries. So ultimately, we have to design, reshape a new world, recreate bonds. We have to imagine and design a new world with new balances of powers, and we have to have a European reasoning. That means that the New Deal has to evolve. We need to put forward solutions and funding for innovation. With new technologies, we need to rethink farming, something that is accurate, that would be able to scale up and to respond to all the needs and increase the income of farmers. It's not only a matter of price, but it's a price multiplied by the volume. This is how it ends up. So we need to find the right equation between competitiveness, price, volume. We need to increase the potential of production of the stakeholders in France and Europe. How could we do it? Well, we have to work on innovation heavily, because if we say, okay, tomorrow we have to work on a decarbonated stream, which is what is at stake in farming nowadays. I'm developing that subject. It is essential. We need to know how we can find solutions for each link of the manufacturing and processing stream to guarantee to consumers that the bread that they will eat, the baguette, will be decarbonated. And each time they will buy a baguette, they will work for the climate, in favor of climate, because the company will have committed towards that. How can we change that? How can we transform the wheat stream, the wheat business line? It's interesting to see how we can go from the farmers, then the mills, the bakeries, and so on. This can be done thanks to new energy. We can decarbonate easily with a change in logistics. But it's more difficult at the farmers' level because there's a lot at stake in terms of seeds and fertilizers. We import carbon. And for baguette, actually, fertilizers account for 5% of the price. So if we would have winter fertilizers, 5% of our carbon footprint would be off, would be deducted. So it goes beyond. What is at stake is beyond the farming business industry. We have to look at the whole industry. How about having green fertilizers manufacturers in France? We should buy those green fertilizers. Of course, we should set it off and have other offsetting mechanisms, but we can change the food chain and show and demonstrate that when we scale up, it is possible. So many factoring companies are working towards that direction. We need to scale up, and for this, we need massive transformation. We have to see how how pesticides evolved. How can we find alternative solutions to pesticides? Can we have biostimulants? How can we work on control? How can we work on the quality of soils? How can we get into this momentum? And this has a price, and we need to do all this at a competitive price, because if it is 50% more costly, then nobody will buy it. So we need to make it to deliver on our promises. There's a lot of solutions that are not well known, and they are on the table, they are in existence. I'm very optimistic. How can we fund this transition? How can we tag this public expenditure to fund this transformation? And then the market will be here and will deliver, because we'll be competitive and will not be more costly than others. I don't want to speak too much at length, but there are solutions. We're working on it. Suppliers work on it. There is competition. But in the US, in Brazil, we know that there's a lot of conscience. They are aware of how much important it is. In the 5-10 years to come, there will be a lot to fight against climate change, and we will show that farming is part and parcel of the solution. Thank you. You gave me the right transition for the next speaker, because we can see that the question is how, as a farmer, can we move forward on this question of income without necessarily undermine environmental transition. We needed to put on hold a lot of mechanisms in France. How can we manage to address everything at once? You are at the head of a vineyard and cereal farm, aren't you? Yes. You've said a lot of things. Today, we ask so much from farming, apart from the ancestral role, which was to feed people. Everything that we do has a cost. It requires know-how. So we look for sources of income, obviously. There are several things. What is the consumer willing to pay for this? I'm only talking about France, then you can actually scale up to the world. We think that it's a right to because we haven't been hungry for some time now, so we are not ready to pay a high cost for our food. But then how can we fund it? We need to work for biodiversity. We need to make sure that labor is well paid. Everything costs money for the farmer. That's a starting point. But there's also a second thing, and I go back to what you said, Mrs. SUWA. We are in a food system, because this is what you're talking about, where there are some operators that actually account for a significant part of the whole volume. So how about the breakdown and the allocation of value on the whole production system, from the production to the distributor? And there's something that could be actually a synthesis of everything. We are in Aix-en-Provence. That's the first département for fisheries. We are in full fisheries swing season. And in Château Renard, we have tier A fisheries.
Sur ce mine, directement au
And the same peaches, sorry, it's not fisheries, but peaches. Yesterday, they were sold at 5.09 euros. So we can see that everything is inaccurate here. So this is quite interesting, this issue, because we have to get an interest in the way we produce and what it means in preservation of nature, ecosystems, sharing with our co-workers, doing some research, but also what about the value that we generate with our food? Because I told you that the allocation of cost is decreasing in the household, but who's taking that money? Because there's something that is really important in a chain. A chain has the resistance of the weakest link in the chain. And so if that is the weakest link, at one point it will break, and all the progress that we try to implement will not be there anymore. We won't move forward, we'll go backwards. And if we stop here and it's not profitable anymore, because this is business, everything that we put together with it will stop at once. Thank you. You're saying that it can be put on hold because of the political context, and this is why nothing is done for the farmers. Stop. Let's talk about Brazil.
Avec vous, Nathalie BEGHIN, vous me disiez le système n'est plus tenable.
You said that the system is not viable anymore. We have to get out of it. We are having a system that is a killer. What have you set up in Brazil to fight against this? Hello, everyone. I'm talking to Europe first and then Brazil, because we're undergoing a tragedy that's one of the greatest food producer, but 30 million people are hungry. That means they don't eat every day according to national official statistics. And this shouldn't be allowed. But what have we done in Brazil? At the beginning of the 90s, 20% of the population was in a situation of serious lack of food safety, and now it's 5% of the population living in such conditions, which is considered as acceptable. Well, this is what you said, Delico. We have set up a social technology of public policy that has three ingredients. First, a National Council for Food Security and Nutrition, which is an advisory council with the President of the Republic, having 72 members, 24 ministers, 48 representatives of the civil society, and this is where I sit there as a representative of an NGO. And this council is in charge of the setting up of a plan for food safety, and there's also an interministerial chamber of ministers in charge of implementing that plan. This is what you said. We have the coordination. We have also the interministerial coordination to make sure that we anticipate the 3 points that you mentioned: production to fork, consumption, and food security. So the idea to face and address food safety, in our case hunger, is that everyone should work hand in hand together. And thanks to that, we managed to set up public policies to have access to food, with the transfer of income, Bolsa Familia, for instance. I don't know if you're aware of it. It's an enormous transfer program of income. 80 million people are affected. We have also farming production assistance policies, because it's for soya, corn. There's nothing done about beans. This is what we eat every day. And so there's a large program of subsidies for family farming. What we have set up as well, we have a huge school food program for giving food to 40 million children. We also have a regulation system because there's a huge problem of diet. The Brazilian diet is all about maize and beans, but now life is more and more difficult. So ultra-processed food take over, and because it's easier to cook, it's less costly, they take more and more space and more, they take over, they take more place than corn and beans, and this is why more and more people in Brazil are obese. We have the highest obesity rate and that doesn't solve the problem of hunger. We've had an extreme right government for 4 years. They've dismantled everything, and now we have 33 million that are affected. It takes a long time to set it up, to destroy. So we have to pay a lot of attention who we vote for, because everything could be destroyed overnight. And this is what we've lived and what we've gone through in Brazil. Thank you. Carlos Cavelier, you're the president and coordinator of Revolucionaria. That's one of the greatest milk producers in Colombia. Could you say what's a coordinator? Because we're quite intrigued by a dream coordinator. What's a dream coordinator? I'm an anthropologist, so it's hard to be CEO, shareholder of a company. That's a lot of hierarchy. So being a dream coordinator helps me to be at the same level, to work more and see eye to eye with people at the same level. And nobody should be afraid to talk to me. This is why we have decided not to have any hierarchy and that we have no line managers. I'm going to talk about the Colombian economy and agriculture. Unfortunately, I can speak in English. Well, of course you can speak in English if you want.
In Colombian agriculture, a critical step for attaining peace. Colombia is a country with a territory almost twice the size of France, which it has never been able or wanted to control, as Daniel Picot has crudely emphasized to us. This is one of the indirect sources of violence in Colombia. While 51 million Colombians live in 1/3 of the country, on mountain ranges and the valleys between them, in the west and center of the country, 12 million of them, 23%, live in the countryside within the agricultural frontier. They're grouped in some 2.2 million households, agriculture units that cultivate top 10 crops, fruits and vegetables, meat, corn, rice, potatoes, cassava, palm, cocoa, and banana. Their agriculture GDP does not exceed 8% of the national GDP, indirectly generating a gross income per person much less than half of the income of the rest of the Colombian population, mostly urban. The absence of state presence indirectly promotes violence, but the lack of real and outstanding economic opportunities for farmers is a critical factor as well. Peasants in general live in subsistence and poverty with less than 2/3 of the minimum wage. Guaranteeing transformation of their farms to be able to exceed the 1.43 minimum wage that would take them out of monetary poverty must be a national priority. Even in the process of disarmament of armed groups and the abandonment of illegal crops like coca, for traditional, legal, and profitable crops, it's an element without which this objective would not be achieved. Let's take 3 crops that would make a big difference in reducing poverty in Colombia: coffee, cocoa, and milk, lifting a total of 3.3 million people out of poverty and vulnerability, with total produce of 5.6 billion euros of total income. In the case of cocoa, for example, which I would take as an example, last year it produced 60,000 tons in 160,000 hectares. 50,000 families who exported grain and value added of about 150 million euros, leaving them less than a minimum subsistence wage. If Colombia were to plant 1 million additional hectares of cocoa, the income of the more of 250,000 families that would do so would grow to about 2 billion euros, counting slightly higher prices and big improvements in productivity, that is leaving more than 500 euros per household's net income per month, lifting over 1 million people out of poverty. Of course, undoubtedly, agricultural reform, agrarian reform is needed to reach those 1 million hectares of coca planted. To get a glimpse of agricultural potential in the Orinoco in the east, which is mostly inhabited, White Plains inhabited, with 14 million hectares in agricultural frontier, it only planted 6% of it, 1 million hectares. In another exercise of prospection, this 13 million hectares planted could produce 36 million tons of agricultural and livestock products for an additional gross GDP of 34 billion euros. That is an 8% more than national GDP and 1.5 times more than the agricultural GDP, the current agricultural GDP. With the 5.6 billion mentioned above, the agricultural GDP would exceed 17%. If we're able to take the same exercise for tobacco, potatoes, cassava, and other tubers like rice, fruits, avocado, artisanal corn, and vegetables, we would surely have a picture, a resource, budget, and horizons to eliminate rural poverty in Colombia. Thus, Colombia would surpass the 20% of the agricultural GDP that Brazil has in its national accounts. Thus, the gross income of peasants would start to reach a similar income level to the rest of their urban compatriots. Peace would be, at least on the horizon, at least at the economic levels of these 15 million Colombian peasants.
Merci pour votre témoignage également. Je vous propose qu'on aille en Afrique avec vous, Jennifer.
Thank you very much. Let's move across to Africa with Jennifer Barnes. It's good to have you with us. You are head of Africa Green Revolution Forum. So how do you see this transformation of the food system in Africa, and how on earth is it being funded?
So it's always a challenge to speak on behalf of an entire continent. Africa is extremely diverse, but when it comes to our challenges in transforming our food systems, I do think you see a lot of commonalities. More than half of Africa's population lives in rural areas, and of those who live in rural areas, over 80%, I'm even inclined to say 100, is dependent for their income on agriculture value chains. Nevertheless, those that grow the food for Africa are often also the places where you find the highest rates of malnutrition. It's a bitter irony. And I fully agree with some of the urgency that you put forward that something needs to change. Because our rural economies are also the most under-resourced. So our farmers are also the most under-resourced. Just to give an example, on average, we see perhaps 1 tractor or 10 tractors per square kilometers in even the best of circumstances, compared to in India, where the amount of tractors is 123 per square kilometer. I'm not saying that tractors will solve all the world's problems, but it gives an indication in terms of the gap of access to technology, inputs, and all the different things that a farmer actually requires. So my stand in life is actually quite simple. Solve the problems of the African farmer, and we have solved global food systems problems. I'm an Afri-optimist, so I don't want my message to be negative and only about what is not there, because there's also a significant potential on the continent. The Africa Development Bank has calculated that Africa has the potential to generate a food and agribusiness sector of over $1 trillion, partly driven by, of course, the demographic growth, urbanization, and a buoyant middle class. There are more than 36 biodiversity ecosystems across Africa. So also when it comes to matters such as climate action, this continent can actually play a decisive role in addressing some of these challenges. So I'm an Afri-optimist. Africa has the potential to be a breadbasket, not just for the continent, but also beyond. I work for an organization that was established by Kofi Annan purely out of frustration that the green revolution that brought improved seeds to farmers all over the world, including Brazil and Colombia, and the rest of Asia seemed to have surpassed Africa. But we have learned lessons in the almost 2 decades that we've been on the continent, initially focusing on seed systems. And therefore, these are some of my solutions. We need to adopt a food systems approach that is not siloed. And I really applaud the last COP28 that was the most of the food systems oriented COPs ever, because the complexity that our farmers are facing, and I hear you when you say you're running a vineyard, that all of the problems actually come on your table all at once, not in a sequence or siloed ways as often we in the development space would like to see it. So adapt the food systems approach and the complexity that comes with it. The Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is critical to us. Structuring, strengthening internal trade flows on the continent are critical for farmers with surplus to have access to markets and increase their income. But there's a lot more that need to happen, of course. A lot of the key decisions that are being made also by our policymakers on the continent lack actually data and analytics that allow us to make evidence-based decisions. So those are some of the factors that we also need to invest in. But I want to go back to the farmer and about how we manage and drive our value chains. We need integrated value chain solutions that help us across the value chain to reduce fragmentations and mitigate risk. And this could be schemes and programs such as inclusive finance and looking at blended finance instruments. It is also related to how we aggregate and coordinate farmers and link them to offtake markets processors. It's across the value chain, and it's not happening sufficiently enough. I would also like to highlight very briefly a few things. Bridging the last mile to the farmer. It's still easier to get a bottle of Coca-Cola at an affordable price into any rural area than it is for critical items such as improved seeds, fertilizer, and pest control. We need to, it's not only the technology that we develop, it's the business model that helps us to deliver that technology to farmers in an affordable, available way, and also in such a way that they are aware, trained, and knowledgeable on how to apply that. I'm mentioning these methods because the way we approach this is very critical in terms of what can be transformative or not. It's the way how we actually also deliver implementation that will be critical. Lastly, robust government systems and building the state capability to deliver. So many decades after the Malabo Declaration, so many African governments are still not investing 10% of their funding into agriculture. And then lastly, how do we measure progress and how do we hold everybody accountable? That's only the beginning. I'm happy to talk about how we're going to finance all of this going forward. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. On parle de rebâtir le système.
So we're talking about reconstructing the food system, and often the global scale seems to be the most appropriate. But in many countries there is a temptation particularly here in France with political landscape, to talk about protectionism. So how far should we go in these free trade agreements? Perhaps Romain Blanchard, you'd like to tell me about this. What should the stance be here in France? Well, it's difficult for me to answer this question because, as you know, we talked about this because I produce cereal on the one hand, but I also produce wine on the other. So the spontaneous reaction would be to say that France is a big agricultural company, we could be self-sufficient, let's shut down our borders, and like that the prices would correspond to production costs. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. However, as you said, we export a lot, and I'm a wine grower. And if we're talking about figures, here in Aix, 70% of my volume gives over 60% of my export margin. If we shut down the margin, shut down the borders, I'm going to go bankrupt. So that's what we need to include in everything that my neighbours have said. It's a very complex system, agriculture. Locally, we've talked about biodiversity, etc., but all of these discussions are part of an overall balance. I grew up in an open world, and I want the world to remain open. We've talked about transmission and passing things on. I'd like to pass things down to my children. Today, farming has to be open, remain open. So the question of international agreements is not a credible solution, alternative. Well, thank you very much for that. So, Nathalie BEGHIN, in France, we're talking a lot about agreements between Mercosur and Europe. So I'd like to hear you and Mr. Blandinière talk about that. Well, I do not agree with what you've said. I belong to a network of organizations in South America, Mercosur, and we have partnerships with the different European bodies. The principle is okay. However, we're against the Mercosur-Europe agreement because the current state of things is very bad for the Brazilian economy. Because modern agriculture in Brazil is fine, it feeds a lot of animals all around the world, our corn, our soya, but it's destroying our landscapes, the rainforest. Earlier on, we were talking about Mato Grosso, which you had visited. This is a state which is at the heart of the Brazilian savannah, but now it's kilometre after kilometre of nothing. Okay, there may be hemp and corn, but there are no trees. There are no Indian reserves. We've got indigenous peoples there, Aborigines who have been scattered. And we do not want that. We really don't want that. So I think we do need to cooperate, but we need to cooperate in a different manner so that we can feed people healthily, respecting organic agriculture, animals, etc., just like you're trying to do here in France. We too want to be protected. We want to be able to get back to our traditions, have healthy food, and not have highly processed food, ultra-processed food. We don't want that. That's why we're against this agreement. So Thierry Blandinière, would you like to say something? Well, we're against it, but for other reasons. But however, you know, we're on the same line. Because Brazilian agriculture has to take on board environmental, social issues, has to look at its carbon footprint, look at the quality of its soil, look at environmental charters and social charters as well, and look at Europe's equivalents. And we would be delighted to import Brazilian soya if it corresponds to the European norms, but standards, but it's not the case. It's very, very tricky. We cannot reduce our production levels here in France because we would, if we reduce environmental pressure, we lose in yield, and that would mean that we have to import more from Brazil. And Brazil is not making any effort whatsoever to address these particular questions. And so these contradictions that we've been mentioning, a lot of farmers went demonstrating in the street, not only in France but throughout Europe last winter. And it was so that the political decision makers, the governments who are completely out of touch, wanted to get them to understand that we cannot broach a subject or solve a project with a solution which we might just throw in there without taking into consideration the impacts of the decisions. And these mirror clauses are an option. But we didn't accept those mirror clauses. I don't know whether the parliaments are still talking about it. However, it would have been a solution because we'd say, okay, we accept as long as both parties commit to the same vision of the world and farming. So it's a power struggle, a political power struggle. I'm happy to hear that in Brazil, not everybody is on board with the Brazilian government's line, but it is a question of exports. It's like your oil. It's oil for you, if you like. So we have to think about the small-scale farmers as well. It's very, very complicated. There's not a single solution for everything. But everybody has to agree what kind of farming we want in the future. Do we want small-scale farming? It will always exist. It's in France. We need to protect it. These short local circuits, why not? Organic, why not? But for the larger scale farming, we have to take stock of the environmental challenges. We're all fighting the same battle. I went to Brasilia 3 years ago. I met the Minister for Agriculture there in Brazil to talk specifically about this. And it's a bit tricky because when you're talking about the quality of the soil, the quality of soil in Mato Grosso, it's very rich soil. However, French soil is not as rich because they burnt their forests. And if you qualify the quality of soil, Brazil and Mato Grosso is, winning hands up because they're doing better than the French farmers who would try to enhance the quality of their soil. It's very, very tricky. So we have to lay this all out clearly on the table. It's not going to be an easy job, and we have to think about international standards, speak with the same words if we want to have agreements with the Mercosur. I think that's what it's all about. That's my recommendation, at least. So, Jennifer Barnes, how can the African continent weigh in these international exchanges?
Quite interesting. So, I'm not an international trade expert, but I do have a contribution to make, right? So, a few things. International commodity markets impact African farmers in more ways than one, even smallholders in remote villages. The Ukraine crisis has caused a fertilizer crisis on the continent, but it also spurred the interest to create a domestic fertilizer market because we don't want our value chains to lack the resilience and basically be in turmoil every time something happens in the rest of the world. That's number one. Number two, access to international markets, being it Europe, being it Asia, or other parts of the world, is critical for African farmers. But it's for the high value end, and it's often a job creation opportunity for young people coming off university, not being employed. They go into mushroom farming, peppercorn, sweet peppers, etc., for export markets. And yes, we have to look into quality standards. How can we scale that? How can we replicate that? For the majority of African farmers, unlocking regional markets will be the key to growth and welfare. So if in the coming 5-10 years, if another representative, hopefully I'm already retired from AGRA, sits here and still complains that we haven't managed to harmonize and implement the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, we are in deep trouble. And unlocking that comes with other challenges as well, right? It comes with access to available finance for our SME agripreneurs and farmers. It comes with affordable packaging machinery, quality standards, etc. So from my perspective, we're having this conversation on different levels in terms of how it impacts us on the continent. I hope that helps. Lastly, it's difficult also as a continent to always speak with one voice. The challenges are often common, cross-cutting, but in terms of how we engage with the rest of the world, forming one voice, one approach, there's also some opportunism often. It's not helpful. And it's also a critical invitation to the rest of the world to understand that these internal dynamics are linked to global commodity markets, and how you also approach the continent is critical for opportunities across. Lastly, really, Our experience with some of the global commodity value chain, including some of the cash crops, cocoa, coffee, etc., we do not want to replicate that going forward. Let's draw the learnings and the lessons there and try to create a different global commodity system going forward. Thank you.
Carlos Cavelier,
Carlos, what is the right scale for you? Do you think on a global scale? Are you thinking about a national scale? What kind of scale are you thinking about? We have a partnership with the United States and with Europe. We've got free trade agreements, and it's all we're starting to increase our imports. In 2026-27, imports will be completely open. However, we're not really ready for that yet. We have wasted 15 years of hard work with the small-scale farmers to help them to evolve, because we've got 300,000 dairy farmers who could produce 3 or 4 times more milk than is being produced currently, but they produce 10 litres per farmer. That's nothing. It's 5 little bottles of milk. And if they could ramp it up to 100 litres, then we could start to export in the medium term. An equivalent with New Zealand, for example, which really has problems, like everybody, with global warming and methane problems from the cows. We're very clean, and we will have solved, at least I hope so, the problem of methane within the next 6 or 7 years with food supplements for our cows, and that will help us very, very much. Thank you very much for this rich conversation. We've got a few minutes left. Perhaps we'll open the floor up for questions. Please wait for the microphone if you have a question, so that we can hear you properly. Hello, thank you very much. I've got a question either for Mr. Blanchard or for Mr. Blandinière. It's a question about France. This is about animal production. I have a fear, and I want to know if you share this fear, and if you do share it, what do you think we can do to solve the problem? And the problem is this. My fear is that in 15 years, we will be in France having animal production like we've been in the nuclear field about 18 months ago, i.e. we realise that everything's broken down, that we've lost all of our expertise, that we've lost of our competitivity. If you compare with our neighbours, etc., we're not as competitive as they are, and we are about to reach the point of no return. Do you share that fear? And if you do share that fear, what can we do about it? Hello. Well, I'm not going to be very positive, sadly, because I do share your fear. When we see agricultural demographics and we see breeding farms particularly, your fear is quite justified. We see that there is a trend in society to really blame breeding on everything. We talked about methane, and there's a kind of multifaceted attack on agriculture, not to mention the quality of life of these breeding farms. If you're in the dairy farm, you've got to be 6 a.m. in the morning with your cows. You've got to be there also at 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. every day. It becomes very, very easy. And it's even harder when it's not generating any revenue, which is the case today. And so these industrial sectors are quite structured because we process those raw materials. We don't sell raw milk, of course. And when you take a look at what we've got in the industry, we will be less competitive. And we can look back over the past 30 years, we've destroyed our dairy industry, and it would take so much money to be invested to get back up to scratch again. Well, you've said absolutely everything there is to say there. There is a bit of a challenge, and it's difficult to manage this. If we wish to be competitive, we need to revamp the industry business model, which is a question of size and the different farms. You need to finance more robotics, less hard work on the human beings, and less arduous working conditions. And so you need to have farms that are of a size that it's difficult to implement here in France today. I'm not talking about the farm with 1,000 cows, but sadly, public opinion is not ready to accept this change in business model. However, it would be the solution if we want to be sovereign and if we want to protect the environment, because very, very often, and Eastern Germany, which is now part of Germany in general, they demonstrated that they were able to have a circular economy and to be very competitive for milk, chicken and pork today. And so their trade balance has really switched since East Germany has been included into Germany, because now Germany is taking advantage of that region. They reinvented the model in accordance with the German ecologists to demonstrate that a big farm was even good for the planet. And it was also competitive. And so that's how they have been the biggest producers in Europe. And that is why today there's less chicken and pork and all that in Brittany today, because it's all imported from Germany. I'm not talking about Asia, I'm talking about Germany. So Poland and the Ukraine in the future, you can see what the challenges are. Yes, one can worry about the French industry today because of that type of program, because we will no longer be competitive and we will be lagging further and further behind. So the solutions are in the countryside. We need to take stock of that. We need to find partners in Europe, or we have to redesign our business model, and that will require a lot of political will. So shall we take a last question before we allow Akiko to wrap up there? No, we've not got enough time for a final question, so I'll hand over to Akiko for the conclusion. I would like to thank you all very much for the quality of your input and the diversity of the points of view that have been expressed. You haven't hesitated to get into the nitty-gritty, but to add nuance. And that, I think, is something which we are falling short of today. It's so important. So I also think that we've got some subjects which came back a lot: international integration, climate, reality, being at the right scale, geopolitics, Europe, and fairly sharing things, the potential of African countries, and breeders and farmers in Colombia, innovation dreams, and the vulnerability that we all stand at the risk of with political reversals. Thank you very much for listening.